Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and just to share how we're using art towards our mission of thriving African youths. So my name is Tom. I am the co-founder of Shamiri Institute. And Shamiri is a Swahili word that means thrive. We envision a future where young people in Africa and eventually around the world can be able to actualize their life potential. And we're trying to do this by enabling young African youths to access affordable and effective mental health and wellness solutions. So, as one of the early speakers mentioned, mental health issues are very widespread and they're largely untreated. And they prevent young people from flourishing. And this is the case especially in sub-Saharan Africa and similar countries in the global south. So 45% of the global burden of disease amongst folks who are aged 13 to 24 is due to mental health problems. In Kenya, which is my home country, 2.5 million youths struggle with mental health issues. Across Africa, that number is about 50 million youths. Unfortunately, in Kenya, we only have one mental health caregiver for every 1 million Kenyans. That's across the whole population. And the whole country has only two child and adolescent psychiatrists. And one of our collaborators normally jokes that he trained the two of them. He's a psychiatrist. But that just really paints a picture of the challenge of mental health and really calls to attention that traditional ways of thinking about mental health and mental health care that involve traditional caregivers and traditional psychiatrists and psychologists cannot just work in this context, given the paucity of mental health caregivers. Why is this problem even more important? The problem is particularly acute because half of the population in Kenya is under the age of 20. So we're a very youthful population. And this applies to similar countries, just not Kenya, but across sub-Saharan Africa. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, the median age is 19, so many countries where you have such a youthful population, yet a lot of them are really struggling with mental health problems. So that is the core of the work that we're trying to do at Shamiri is how can we allow this very youthful, very young population to be able to actualize their life outcomes. And I think one way of doing that is by, expanding access to effective mental health and wellness solutions. So the natural question is, how do you do that, given that not only do we have a scarcity of mental health providers, but second, there's also a lot of societal stigma because of the history of traditional psychiatry and traditional mental health that really prevents young people from health seeking. So how do you design a solution, around that? So we think the solution is we need to deliver low stigma, low touch therapy through what we call a tiered lay provider model. So I'm going to explain what this is, that is implemented within communities. So the idea generally is that there are very low touch, low stigma interventions that can be delivered by folks who don't have a mental health background within community contexts, which can act as really potent, really effective mental health interventions. And we can use this, as the first point of entry towards dealing with mental health and eventually integrating it, with the work that, the few psychologists and few psychiatrists are doing. So basically, so this slide kind of explains it. So the idea is you can develop these low-touch interventions and obviously need to test them in clinical trials, and that's why we call them data-driven interventions. And then you deliver them through this tiered model. So we call our tiered model a for youth and by youth tiered model. And so the way this model works is at the bottom of the model, you have folks who we call lay providers. So lay providers are people who don't have a formal mental health background, but they can be trained to deliver effective mental health interventions. And they are supervised by the second level of the tier, who we call clinical supervisors. In the US context, they'll be the equivalent of social workers, for example. And so they train the lay providers and supervise them, and also triage the very few cases that need more intense support to sort of the third tier, which is the clinical expert. So rather than building a whole different mental health care model, we're just building a model that feeds eventually, into the traditional level of caregiving, and you're doing this through community-based delivery with a lot of stakeholder involvement. So that at a high level is what we're trying to do in Kenya. So let me talk about interventions, because we need to intervene. So as I said, the low-touch, low-stigma interventions can improve human functioning and can be effective for mental health. And whereas we are starting to show a lot of evidence for this in Kenya, there's a lot of folks, for example, Vikram Patel in India, etc., who've also shown this work in other parts of the world. So this is not just in Kenya, but around the world, starting to coalesce that there are these very simple things that we can be doing that can really have a very potent effect on our mental health. And what we're really trying to do is to test these things and see how we can scale them up. So a few years ago, I, like many of us here, met Doris, and she explained to me and introduced me to this intervention called Pretax, which I'm going to talk about soon, which is an arts literacy intervention. And how Pretax work is, it tries to stimulate civics, innovation, etc. And it was mostly used in an educational context, but it kind of like appeared to me to be one of these types of low-touch interventions that we could use, for mental health. And so I'm going to use the example of Pretax to just walk us through how we do this three tiers that I talked about. So how we take an intervention, we try to test it and get data that it works, and then we try to embed it into everyday practice through this tiered caregiving model, and how we deliver it in community-based context. So for those of us who are interested in the literature, so the formal literature on these low-touch interventions is called WISE interventions, or character strength interventions. And the general idea is that these types of interventions, they unlike traditional mental health interventions, they don't focus on psychopathology, but rather they focus on improving overall human flourishing and human functioning by targeting core beliefs that we have about ourselves and about our world. And one way of thinking about this is, if someone is depressed, you can focus on the depression, and that's what we do traditionally. But the thing you can do is you can realize that the depression comes from a network of many other things, social, emotional, optimism. We're all in this really complex system or network from the early presentation. And we can design interventions around these other things that can really eventually reduce depression symptoms and result into overall well-being. So the question I met Doris was, could Pretax, which had been used initially as an art literacy intervention, but what it really does, was improve individual agency, make people see that they can think about the world differently and, be agents who have autonomy and can act, which seemed, at a high level to be potentially effective from a mental health perspective. So the question was, could this intervention be used as a mental health intervention? So in summary, Pretax is an educational protocol that supports a wide range of goals, but they all start from literacy, innovation, and citizenship. And the core behind Pretax is this question of making art from a text and reflecting on the process. So how this works concretely is in classrooms and in our life, we always are interfacing with text. But often we see text as the conclusion. When you go to a class, there's an assigned text. That is the end of the conversation. I'm supposed to read that text and, do an exam on that text. But we try to think about the text as a raw material to begin and to cultivate an artistic process, rather than thinking about it as the end of the conversation. We think about the text as the beginning of the conversation, and we try to make art from it, and we reflect, kind of on that process. And so it involves a lot of active listening, drawing exercises, et cetera, et cetera. So we conducted an RCT in Kibera in Kenya to investigate these premises. So let's quickly walk us through this RCT. So we chose Kibera because it was a place where we felt that there was the highest need for such mental health intervention. So Kibera is the largest slum in Africa. It's about 300,000 people living in an area the size of Central Park. And it's just a very, kind of like difficult place, to work in. And so that's why we did this RCT. We had about 235 students from 2 high schools who participated in this RCT. So this is a universal RCT, so what this meant was any student who wanted to participate could participate, and that is very important because traditionally RCTs are limited to people who have elevated symptoms, but that sometimes lends itself to stigma, and we wanted to really, kind of avoid that. So how this worked out was students met once a day for a week. So after at 4 p.m. after classes ended, they met in groups of 6 to 12, and they used a text, which is actually one of the signed literature texts, as the raw material for engaging in art. These groups were facilitated by high school graduates aged 18 to 24. Importantly, for our conversation in the morning, we use an active study skills control. So we, really had a control group of equal dosage and duration, so we can say definitively that any effect that we have is due, for example, to Pretax rather than to the idea of just being in a group or participating in, in activities. And collected data at 4 time points. And what we found, and so this is some of the groups that the students are participating in. And so what we found was that participation in this intervention led to, significant reductions in depression and anxiety symptoms. And so these are some of the graphs. We found the same as well, for anxiety symptoms. So in conclusion, an arts literacy program that seems very simple, that can be, conducted very cheaply and very cost effectively, can reduce anxiety and depression symptoms. So why does this matter? This matters because it gives us an opportunity to move from today's state of the world where there exists a treatment gap, where mental health, measurement are not really designed for students, where treatments are not culturally appropriate, to a new world where we can, use these very simple interventions like Pretax and expand our pool of caregivers, etc. And what we hope to do over the next 5 years is to scale this model of using this low-scale, low-cost, low-touch interventions like Pretax to 1 million youths starting from Kenya, and hopefully use this as a template for the rest of the world can do. Thank you.